Welcome back to Nonfiction for Life, the podcast with authors who write compelling true stories and books with great ideas for living well. I'm your host, Janet Perry, and today we'll be talking to Joelle Glenn Brenner, author of the best-selling book, The Emperors of Chocolate, Inside the Secret World of Hershey and Mars. The book was published in 1999 through Random House, but just like chocolate itself, it continues to hold its appeal. Joelle Glenn Brenner began reporting on the candy business in 1989, and she was the first and only journalist ever to gain access to the Mars Company. Her Washington Post magazine cover story on Mars won numerous prizes, and she was recognized 5 times by the Financial News Journalism Reporter as one of the best financial journalists in the nation under the age of 30. This year, Joelle started a new writing project about the fertility industry with screenwriter Carly Steiner. She and Steiner collaborated previously on adapting The Emperors of Chocolate for a limited series TV show, which is still in development. Today, it's a special treat to have Joelle Glenn Brenner join us on the Nonfiction for Life podcast. So grab your favorite chocolate candy and get comfortable because you're in for a treat. Welcome to the program, Joelle. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
This book was published in 1999, and
yes,
it turns out in the 1980s you were a journalist and a business writer for the Washington Post, and this was an assignment, I believe, investigate these competing chocolate giants, Hershey and Mars. And as fun as it sounds like it might have been a tough assignment after all. Maybe you can give us a little background on what you had to do to get access and how long it took to capture this story, The Emperors of Chocolate.
The original assignment was actually a lot more limited than the book itself. It started out as what would seem like a very typical assignment for a general business reporter, which is what I was at the time. And that was to get inside or get some kind of profile of Mars Incorporated. And most people are familiar with the candy side of Mars. They're the ones who make M&Ms, Snickers, Three Musketeers, Skittles, Starburst, all those candies. But Mars is a much larger corporation than that. They also have an enormous pet food division. In fact, half of their revenues come from pet foods. And it's a very global company. But for the Washington Post, it's a local company because their headquarters is in McLean, Virginia, in the suburbs of D.C. And so it was a local editor who gave me the assignment. And I just thought it was like any other assignment. And so I went back to the morgue, which is what they call the library at a newspaper. And I went to look up, past stories and come to find out there's nothing there. And lo and behold, it doesn't take me long to understand that Mars is actually a privately held firm, and it's one of the most secretive firms actually in the world. And they are notorious for not giving access to the press, for not answering questions of journalists, really for not participating in any way with anything that has to do with, beyond their own advertising. They just don't speak about their business. And so I sort of went back to the editor and I laughed and I said, "Are you serious about this?" And he said, "No, I want you to do this story." So someone else actually at the Post had gotten a peek inside Mars a few years before that with a brief interview with the general counsel, a man by the name of Ed Stegeman. And so I went to Tom's desk and I said, "I understand you've once spoken to the general counsel at Mars. Do you have a folder? Any information you can give me?" And sure enough, he had a phone number for Ed, but that was really all the background that he had. So I started calling Ed and asking for an interview, essentially, which I think for any other company would be normally, an expected and appropriate thing. But Ed told me bluntly that Mars had no interest whatsoever in cooperating with the Washington Post or any other newspaper, and, thank you very much, but no. Well, I then decided that the best strategy really to go after this story was to just keep, I don't want to use the word pestering, but that was sort of what happened, pestering Ed. And I made it very clear to Ed that I was not going to be satisfied if I was going to base a profile just on the people who'd already left the company, that I wanted to do something that reflected reality, and I didn't trust those who'd moved on or perhaps were fired or who knows the circumstances of their departure, and I very much wanted to speak with current employees. So Ed and I eventually had this little game that we came up with when I would call him in the morning, and he would criticize actually the front page of the Washington Post. And we'd chatter about the Post and the decisions of stories that went on the front page, and it became a friendly conversation, and he came to sort of expect my phone calls. And a year and a half went by, and I'm still doing this, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, Ed calls me, which is the first time that had ever happened. And I picked up the phone, and he said, "Joelle, do you still really want to do something right about our company?" And I laughed, and I said, "Of course." And he said, "Well, do you have any lunch plans? Why don't you come out? We'll have lunch." And I dropped the phone, and I thought, oh, my God, nobody's going to believe that this actually happened. And in the meantime, I had changed reporting beats, and I had moved on to cover banking and savings and loans, and my new editor didn't even know about this assignment. So I went up to the man who was the head of the business section at the time, an amazing man named Peter Bear, and I explained to Peter that for the last year and a half, I had been pursuing this story. And Peter laughed, and he said, "Do they really want to meet with you?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, what are you doing here? Go." And so I went, and Ed and I had lunch, and I explained to him that I really had no agenda, which was absolutely true. I didn't know what to think of the company. I had no purpose other than to fulfill the original assignment I was given, which was to write a profile about them. So Ed, we talked back and forth, what would be the advantages, the disadvantages, and I think they were already leaning towards doing it, but I remember the argument that I gave to him, which was basically, if you cooperate with me and I write a great profile and you love it, well, then you can just hand it out to every other journalist who comes along after me and say, "We've spoken, right? Here's the story that was written." And that way you can shut them down. Or if I write a profile and you hate it, then you can also use it. Any journalist calls you in the future and you could say, "We're never cooperating again. We cooperated this one time, and see what happened with the Washington Post." I said, so either way, you gain.
Very sly.
And within a few months, we really had worked out, really what turned into an extraordinary experience for me as a journalist, where I went around to Mars factories around the country and actually around the world, and became the first journalist to ever openly get inside that company and document their working practices and their philosophies and, how they operated and what they were doing and what was so different about them. And it was really the first time that they had ever opened up. And then that story ran in the Washington Post Sunday magazine, got a lot of attention, obviously. And shortly thereafter, I was offered a book deal. But what I explained to Random House was that I had done all of this reporting on Mars, and it had taken me another, year and a half of work. And I really wanted to explore something bigger if I was going to write a book. And I said that I had heard in my reporting on Mars, I'd heard a story that I couldn't believe was true. But it had that feeling of truth about it. So I wanted to investigate it. And if I found out that the story was in fact true, then I knew exactly the book I was going to write. So the story was this. The story was that Mars's most famous candy by far, M&Ms, was actually the result of a partnership between Forrest Mars and someone from Hershey. And all I could think to myself is, these two companies are, among the greatest rivals. They rival, it's like the Coke and Pepsi rivalry. And I couldn't imagine that there could be a time where they would be in partnership over something. So I went to see if this was in fact true. And it didn't take a whole lot of reporting. In fact, I showed up in Hershey, Pennsylvania and started asking questions. And the first thing I heard was, those people at Mars took advantage of us. We were partners with them. We were doing business together, and then they tossed us aside, and it's been awful ever since. And it was really very interesting. So I went back to Random House, and I said, sure enough, these companies were once allies, and now they're bitter rivals. And I think the tale of how that, developed over time would be a fascinating one. And that's what turned into the Emperors of Chocolate. And it really turned out to be more of a history almost of American small business as told through these two candy giants, and also a story about how these two businesses operate and how very different they are, and how they were in fact once partners in a lot of ways, and then that partnership blew up largely as a result of the actions of Forrest Mars, and they've been grand rivals ever since.
It's such an incredible story. You mentioned Pepsi and Cola, or Pepsi and Coke, and in the book you say that the story you uncovered put the Cola Wars to shame, and we're much more familiar with that rivalry. And you say that you found it was not the business strategies or product innovations or hidden secrets that kept my attention. It was the extraordinary characters behind the candy bars we take for granted. And you've talked about Forrest Mars quite a bit. And Milton Hershey, I would love you to just juxtapose those two for us, because we think of chocolate as chocolate and candy as candy, but the men behind these two behemoths really influenced the company and then the rivalry. So tell us about those two men and how they differ.
Sure. I mean, those two men are characters that if I had written as a work of fiction, I don't think anybody would believe, their life stories. And it just turned out purely by accident. I didn't know this going in, but that they are almost polar opposites. And for my purposes as an author, it turned out that they were great foils for one another, and just made that story so much more interesting than even I had ever imagined it could be. Forrest Mars, who I mentioned, he was really responsible for turning the Mars Company into the global conglomerate that it is today. And he did not start the company. The company was started by his father, but he ended up taking over the company and really remaking it into something that his father probably would never have recognized. But essentially, Forrest Mars said from the get-go that he wanted to build empires. He wanted to use these products to build a business empire, the likes of which no one had ever seen. And Milton Hershey, on the other hand, couldn't have been more different. It turns out that Milton Hershey, while we all know about Hershey bars, and maybe we know a little bit about the town of Hershey, Pennsylvania, very few people understand the benevolence of Milton Hershey and the extraordinary philanthropy that he carried on throughout his life. And I learned what I thought was really an extraordinary business story for its time. Milton Hershey was probably the first mega wealthy magnate here in the United States who gave away all of his money before he died. Now, we hear about that all the time now with people like Bill Gates or George Soros or others who, it's become very to give away your wealth while you're still alive. But back then, it was practically unheard of. And Milton Hershey actually founded the Hershey Chocolate Company, not because he was interested in business, but because he wanted to better the world. And he wanted to do that by creating his version of a utopian kind of community that would be basically financed by the profits of the company and provide all the workers for the company. And he also gave away all of his wealth to start what was then a school for orphaned boys. And that school is the Milton Hershey School. And while today it's co-educational, there are boys and girls there, and it's no longer just open to orphans, it's open to kids from all kinds of troubled backgrounds and broken homes, the Milton Hershey School, few people realize, is actually the owner of the chocolate company. It's the school. So they do have publicly traded shares, but you'll find if you look at the history of their share price, it stays fairly steady because the biggest shareholder is actually the trust, the Hershey Trust, which Milton Hershey created while he was very much alive because he wanted this school to outlast him, and he wanted to create a warm and wonderful place for kids who had troubled backgrounds to go and become, wonderful citizens of this nation. So he had a very, very different philosophy about why he was in business, what he was doing with his money than Forrest. But they were both incredibly dynamic characters, and they both had very, very strong ideas about how to run a business and what it took to be successful. It just turns out that their ideas are almost, exactly opposite, and yet both of them wound up being, truly, truly successful companies. And today, when you buy a Hershey bar, your money is actually going to support the Milton Hershey School, which has a larger endowment than Harvard, by the way.
Wow. Well, the book reads almost like a fairy tale, this pitting good empire against evil empire. And yet both, we have to admit, both companies or both men were competitive. They wanted to produce popular products for decades, and even though their motivation might have been different, and they've stayed afloat for over 100 years. So this teeter-tottering that went back and forth between the top position, the number one chocolate company versus number two, just goes back and forth through the whole book, which makes it a really fun read. They both, one thing I noticed they did have in common was this guarding of the secrets. They needed to guard their recipes and their manufacturing processes. And that's what creates kind of that Willy Wonka atmosphere. What lengths did they go to? Since you got the inside access, what lengths did you see them going to guard those secrets?
Well, first, let me point out to the listeners that the Roald Dahl book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, was actually based upon what Roald Dahl witnessed in the UK in the time of his life, which was the rivalry between the Cadburys and the Roundtrees. And again, those were two families who both owned private candy companies, and their rivalry was epic. And they were also highly secretive. So that book is really a reflection of the reality of the candy business. And the reason that candy companies, particularly back then, were so secretive about their, as you said, manufacturing processes and their ingredients was because basically they're selling something that can't be patented. Okay, you've got a food product, and somebody else could come along and make a chocolate covered piece of caramel that's just as good as yours. So what could you do, to give yourself the edge? And in each case, these men created candies that were unique in their day, and then they maintained market share because they supported those candies with national sales, which was very new. Up until Hershey and Mars came along, much of the candy business in America was a very regional business and very local, and most of it was run by families as small businesses. When Mars and Hershey entered the picture, they really changed the game. And their ability to market and sell coast to coast and penetrate every drugstore, every gas station, everywhere consumers went, that was really a new concept. And that was part of Forrest Mars's philosophy, which was that if you put candy in front of the customer, they will buy it. You just have to get it in front of them, that it's irresistible and they won't be able to pass it up. And the fact that we see candy at the checkout counter, by the way, is very much because that's what Forrest insisted. He built special racks so that his candy bars could be right there at the checkout where you were more likely to pick up a 5-cent candy bar. The secrecy, for both companies was handled a bit differently. At Hershey, they actually did give tours of their chocolate factory back in the day, the real thing. Now, of course, you go on a simulated ride. But back in the day, you could actually go through the chocolate factory and see them making the chocolate and then, get a sample candy bar at the end of the tour. And this was one of the ways that Milton wanted to promote, his quality of manufacturing so that people could see it for themselves. And what he kept so secret was not so much, his recipe, but how he had acquired that Hershey chocolate flavor, which if you do a taste test and you try different kinds of chocolate, you'll notice each one has very distinct and unique flavor. And Hershey's flavor is very distinct. And most Americans grew up on Hershey's, so we don't think of it as being particularly different, but it's actually much different than most milk chocolate. And that was because of the way that Milton Hershey learned or figured out how to mix milk and fat. And that's like mixing oil and water, which never mix. And that was something that you had to figure out in order to create a milk chocolate bar. And it was hundreds of years before anybody had perfected techniques to do this. And then they had done it in Europe. Henry Nestle was the first to crack the code. And then milk chocolate proliferated in Europe. And Milton Hershey saw some of those ideas on his trips to Europe, but had not really gotten a good handle on how to make milk and cocoa butter mix well together. So he did a bunch of experiments, and he came up with his own process. And that process is the Hershey prized secret, very much the way that Coca-Cola has the secret for their Coke recipe. We don't really know what goes into it. In the case of Hershey's chocolate, we don't really quite understand how they mix their milk and cocoa butter and cocoa powder together to make a chocolate bar. And that's their big, big secret. When it comes to Mars, what they keep private, besides the fact that they're a privately held company, and so they don't have to answer to shareholders, so they feel no real, need to cooperate with journalists or talk about their business openly because they're a private company. But they also are very, very tight-lipped about their manufacturing processes because Forrest Mars was a genius when it came to laying out a factory line, efficiency. He could get more candy going, thousands and thousands of bars produced per hour. He put Hershey to shame when it came to efficiency of operations. And he actually took a lot of standard candy manufacturing equipment and altered it to make his factories, work so incredibly smoothly and quickly. And he never wanted anybody to see the inside of his plants. And so one of the things that I sort of thought was interesting was that if Mars had to have an outside contractor come in to fix something in one of their facilities, they would, if necessary, blindfold them so that they could not see the whole operation. Come in, fix the one piece of equipment that needed fixing, and blindfold them, and then off they went.
Wow.
So the fact that I got inside those factories and got to watch, I think they figured with me, I really didn't understand a lot of the technicalities of what I was looking at, so I couldn't share anything with anybody. And they did monitor very closely the pictures that they let our photographer take inside the factories to make sure we weren't giving anything away. But it was extraordinary to get inside those plants and see just how incredibly clean they were, how incredibly fast they were, and to really see Forrest's understanding of business, at work on the line.
There's this great paranoia in the industry about stealing secrets, and sometimes they're stolen, or I guess they're stolen, and sometimes they're just imitated. And you give the examples of Hershey's score bar recipe that was actually copied from Heath, and the British Mars bar, the country's favorite, evidently, is a slightly sweeter version of our American Milky Way. And Starburst fruit chews are the same as Britain's opal fruits. And so I'm wondering, do the candy companies consider this illegal or unethical in any way, or is it just expected? It's just standard for the industry?
Well, you have to look back in time and understand that 100 years ago, there was really no such thing as a global economy. Everything was very regional. Everything stayed within a country's borders. There wasn't very much international exchange of foods of any kind. And so every country, while people individually would travel and see things from country to country, it was very common to take an idea, that you saw in Norway and bring it back to your hometown in Spain and do your own version of it, right? And so nobody really cared back then because it wasn't really considered competition, right? The customers in Spain weren't going to go to Norway and vice versa. Things have changed dramatically, obviously, as the world has become smaller and smaller, and now brands truly have to be global on every level. And I think that's really where some of these copies have come, been interesting. So, for example, here we always had Almond Joy and Mounds. Well, Forrest Mars knew about Almond Joy and Mounds because he was American. But he went over to the UK when he started his business there, and he eventually introduced his own version of coconut and chocolate candies called Bounty. And what I thought was most interesting was in the early 90s, Mars brought Bounty full circle by introducing it here in America, even though it was a copy of Mounds and Almond Joy, which had become owned by Hershey. And so Mars wanted to have its version to compete head to head. The Bounty bar didn't really do particularly well here because it just wasn't that well known. People didn't understand what it was. But in Europe, the Bounty bar is still a huge seller. They've never heard of Mounds and Almond Joy. So that's kind of the way that the candy world has worked, and it's worked fairly well. Nobody really accuses anybody, of doing anything unethical. But today, obviously, there are much higher stakes, and the companies all protect, their brand names as much as possible. But even now, we have, funny things like when Hershey introduced this version of Reese's Pieces that had package coloring that was virtually identical to M&Ms, which I thought was really, really funny when they went to a dark brown wrapper and you looked at the two wrappers, one for Reese's Pieces and one for M&Ms. And for a while there in 1994, they looked almost identical. So there's still, a lot of trying to sort of edge out the competition, and it is very fierce competition. But a lot of our candy tastes, it turns out, are very sentimental, shall I say. So the candies that you ate in your childhood tend to be the candies that you eat as an adult, and that doesn't tend to change a whole lot. So that's one of the reasons why the candy companies also kind of limit the number of candies that they introduce each year, because they find that the things that sell the best are the ones that have been around the longest. So while each of the giants may tweak their lineup, a little bit here or there, the same best sellers have sort of been the same best sellers, going on 75 years now.
Yeah, you mentioned that you really point out clearly there's a limitation on the number of ingredients that go into these candies, but the industry actually averages 150 new products a year, yet only a handful of them become popular enough to stay on the shelf. And you say that it turns out anyone who developed a truly new candy almost always did it by accident. So what are some of those accidental products that we enjoy now? The lucky accidents.
Sure. I think one of the more famous ones would be the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup, which was actually developed by a man whose last name was Reese, the H.B. Reese Company. And believe it or not, he started his factory just a mile down the road from Hershey's chocolate factory in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And he had worked at Hershey and had, been on the line as a worker. And he actually thought that the Mr. Goodbar, which is, whole peanuts inside chocolate, that it would taste better somehow if he could figure out a way to concentrate that peanut flavor. And so he went off and he did experiments, and he accidentally sort of came upon a recipe for the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup and started his own company, very, very successful firm. Hershey eventually does buy Reese's, and it becomes part of the Hershey brand. But originally it was an independent company, and the accident there was basically, if you think about it, peanut butter has an awful lot of oil in it, and chocolate has a lot of cocoa butter. It was very, very hard for H.B. Reese to come up with a way to make a peanut butter cup that could last on the shelf, where the oils didn't blend and make it taste bad, or make the chocolate all, kind of melty, or, go rancid. So he came up with the really brilliant idea of taking the majority of the oil out of the peanut butter, using a press to create what he called a peanut meal. And he took that meal, and that's what he put inside his peanut butter cup. Mm-hmm. And he made peanut butter cups famous. And then peanut butter cups are, of course, you can go into any candy store and find, that they're selling a peanut butter cup, but none of them taste like a Reese's peanut butter cup, because he had this brilliant idea for how to make that inside. And that allowed him to sell his product coast to coast, and it lasted, for 6 months, which is how products have to last if they're going to go on the grocery shelves.
Mm-hmm. Well, this idea of dealing with the fat seems to be what we love, but what's kind of the nemesis for them, and they have those companies that have managed to figure it out are the ones who rise. And you mentioned how candy didn't used to be a global product. And it's interesting that expeditions and wars, I guess, have been some of the vehicles for making candy companies more famous, or for, possible to sell more products. So maybe you can start with World War II and tell us how candy played a role in the war and in this rivalry.
I guess just in the same way, I think people are very familiar with Coca-Cola and its role in the war. Our soldiers took it overseas with them, and it was introduced and became popular. And after World War II, suddenly Coca-Cola was not just an American company, but they were opening up bottling plants, overseas, because suddenly there was demand for that American product. And in very much that same way, Hershey played an extraordinary role in World War II, supplying rations to the soldiers, and that name brand became recognizable all across Europe. And they were also, grew tremendously during that period. They were allowed to keep manufacturing, which a lot of food companies, were shut down during the wars because there were shortages. We weren't eating candy, but in wartime, the candy manufacturers are often given special license to manufacture even more products, and the majority of their product ends up going into the soldiers. Back then, considered soldiers' rations. Now they're called meals ready to eat, or MREs. And both companies, both Hershey and Mars, actually do a really big business with the military, supplying their candies on bases around the world, and also in the ready-to-eat packages for wartime.
At the beginning of the book, you quote a nutrition researcher, Michael Levine, who says, "Chocolate's unique mixture of being half fat and half sugar is pure heaven to our brains." And he goes on to say, "Chemically speaking, chocolate really is the world's perfect food." When I read that, I thought, hooray, it's the perfect food. We should all be eating it. But, you think about that. No wonder so many of us are drawn to chocolate. It's not a seasonal item, although at this time of year, a lot of people eat it. And yet, it's not created equal. You said Americans have a predilection for Hershey's kind of chocolate, and European chocolate is different. I just want to know how what are the differences exactly between American chocolate and European chocolate, and how did that play a role in who ruled as the emperor of chocolate?
Well, basically, it all comes down to, again, how you mix milk and chocolate together to make milk chocolate, and the kinds of, um, I guess, manufacturing facilities that they had in Europe to do the process created, in the end, a sort of much more silky chocolate blend, and also in the case of some companies, depending on how they dealt with the milk, it lent a kind of caramel edge to the chocolate. So Cadbury's is actually best known for its sort of caramelly taste. And Nestle, which was the originator, Henry Nestle, who broke the code open and figured out how to mix the two. His chocolate he blended for an extremely long time as a part of getting the two to mix. And so Nestle's and other European chocolates are known for their sort of velvety smoothness. And his process for dealing with the milk and combining it with chocolate actually resulted in the milk going slightly soured. And, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying that's, like sour cream or yogurt, or, that it's a little bit spoiled, so it gives it a different flavor. Hershey chocolate has that unique flavor from the milk turning a little bit before they mix it in with the chocolate. And Europeans really don't consider Hershey chocolate to be fine chocolate at all, and they call it cheesy chocolate because of that slightly soured flavor that's in it. So, they're all recognized as chocolate as long as it's made of a certain percentage of chocolate liquor, which is what you get out of the cocoa pod without the fat. What remains is some of the fat and the rest of the flavoring, and it's called chocolate liquor. And everybody has their own recipe, so it results in something slightly different. But Hershey's definitely uses a lot more sugar, and Americans like generally a sweeter chocolate than most Europeans do.
What's the single best-selling chocolate product in America?
It's M&Ms. If you combine all the different M&M varieties, plain and peanut and all the other ones that are out there now, M&Ms definitely comes away as the biggest. And then next in line is the Snickers bar, which also belongs to Mars. And then the third place contender is the Hershey product, and that's tied really with Kisses and what was I just talking about? Reese's peanut butter cups.
Okay, I want to talk about something that happened that you described in the book that hadn't ever happened before 1982, at least that we know of. There was a very famous movie that came out, E.T. by Steven Spielberg, and in the movie they use Reese's Pieces to lure this extraterrestrial creature. And this strategy today seems really ordinary to us, product placement, but it was new then. And I just think it would be fun for our listeners to hear how that gave a bump to create a shift in the two big chocolate empires.
Well, at the time that E.T. was being filmed, Hershey was really kind of in the doldrums, and their sales had really fallen off, and they needed a way to compete with Mars. And they had come up with this Hershey product that was very similar to M&Ms. And instead of chocolate on the inside, it had this kind of peanut buttery stuff, different than the Reese's peanut butter cup, but still a peanut butter based sugar on the inside. And there's no chocolate in Reese's Pieces at all. But they were having a hard time getting the product to launch because it looked like an M&M sort of Me Too. And actually, Steven Spielberg's original script called for the little girl in the movie to lure E.T. out from the garden shed using M&Ms. That was the original script. But when Spielberg's company went to Mars and asked for permission to use M&Ms, they declined. They did not want their product associated with an alien movie that might be scary, the alien didn't seem particularly attractive. Steven Spielberg didn't have a reputation. And so they just felt like it would be better if they declined and kept M&Ms out of the movie in case it flopped. So that provided an opportunity for Hershey to step in. And Hershey stepped in a very big way, and they said, use our product, and we'll, put $1 million worth of promotion and advertising behind the movie and the product, if you use Reese's Pieces. And sure enough, Spielberg took them up on their offer, and that's what was used in the film. And they also did a lot of marketing and promotion, introduced Reese's Pieces in the theater, and sales of that product just took off with the movie, which of course everyone knows was an enormous success. And the popularity of Reese's Pieces grew right along with E.T. and to this day remains a very, very popular candy, whereas if it had not had that movie tie-in, I'm pretty sure it would have failed miserably and Hershey would have shelved the idea. But that was, in fact, the very first coordinated product placement between a manufacturing company and a film studio. And as you said, now that's a very commonplace thing. Manufacturers, are desperate to get their products onto the big screen. But that was the very first one. And it was almost because of its success that people understood the drive, the boost that a movie could have to almost any brand. And so product placement has become, just another way of doing business.
And yet the bread and butter really of selling candy is the rack. And you mentioned this before. It's the real secret to success is getting to market first, and then whoever controls the most shelf space, rack, wins. And at the time you wrote the book, Mars and Hershey combined controlled about 75% of the candy rack. And I went to the store the other day and I thought, what does it look like in my grocery store? And I think it was more like 90%. I was checking the backs of the candy and, it's either Hershey or Mars.
So there's been a lot of consolidation in the industry since the time I wrote the book. Both Hershey and Mars have gone on huge buying sprees. Mars, for example, now owns Wrigley. And Hershey, for example, owns Twizzlers and Tootsie Roll. And so there's been just an enormous expansion by both companies buying up brands. And I don't know the statistics today. I really don't follow it anymore on a regular basis. But yes, they both have many, many more brands under their control than they used to. And I had projected in the book that the trend, right, toward these two big conglomerates, dominating the market, that would only continue and become sort of more dramatic over time. And that has, in fact, happened. It's very, very hard for a small candy manufacturer today to survive and compete with these two guys.
Mm-hmm. Candy companies gobbling up candy companies. That's what's happening. Yeah. Did you learn anything about intentional placement or the design of the rack space itself, or was it just about getting it there for that impulse buy that people do at the last minute?
No, it's just about, basically putting candy everywhere you can possibly put it so that, consumers can purchase it. So that means vending machines, and that means, every drugstore, supermarket, gas station, you name it. They want to have their product there so that you see it. Because like you said, it is an impulse buy. You don't normally say to yourself, I'm going to the store, to buy a bag of M&Ms. It just sort of happens when you're at the store looking for something else. And, both manufacturers recognize that impulse, and they want to have their product, as much in front of you as possible.
And they're even, back to my trip to the grocery store, they're hitting you before you get to the register. I noticed that Hershey has a couple new products, the Hershey Cookie Layer Crunch, and I guess it's still categorized as candy, and Reese's Pretzels and Snack Mix and so forth. So they're trying to create new candy products that are sort of hybrids, I guess. And so they're hitting us before we get to that that counter where we're pulling out our money. Just before we go, are you aware of who the current emperor of chocolate is?
Well, it's always been on a global basis, Mars has always outshined Hershey because Hershey doesn't really have any global operations. So, looking at it globally, Mars is by far the dominant player. Although, here in the United States, it's been kind of neck and neck. And to be honest with you, I'm not aware of who has the lead at the moment. But the two firms have stayed, fairly even in their competition.
And there doesn't seem to be any evidence of candy going away, so I'm sure they'll continue to fight for the top. This has been really fun talking to you about the Emperors of Chocolate. We thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Joelle Glenn Brenner talk about the Emperors of Chocolate, inside the secret world of Hershey and Mars. It's the book USA Today calls A Sweet Treat, Delicious Fun. I'm your host, Janet Perry, and you've been listening to another episode of Nonfiction for Life, the podcast with authors who write compelling true stories and books with great ideas for living well. Just like chocolate, at Nonfiction for Life, we believe there's something for everyone. We'll talk to you next time.